Hello, this is Brigadier P.S. Gotra. Today we will be discussing many questions regarding the ops in JNK 1947-48. First is the question on the RT firepower, then the leadership qualities of Field Marshal Kariappa, loss of Skardu garrison in operations, and capture of Zojila, Battle of Naushera, offensive teeth, and three more questions will be left with you to work on your own time. Question 1. What were the characteristics features of provision of RT firepower in 1947-48 operations in JNK? The provision of RT firepower during the 1947-48 operations played a crucial role in shaping the outcome of the conflict. Artillery was a key factor in both offensive and defensive operations. Several characteristic features marked the deployment and effectiveness of the artillery firepower in this period. Some of these are discussed in the following slides. One of the significant feature of the 1947-48 operation was the limited availability of RT, particularly on the Indian side. At the time of the conflict, the Indian Army had only recently inherited its share of military equipment from the British Indian Army, and the division of assets between India and Pakistan had left both the nations with inadequate military resources. Consequently, artillery pieces were in short supply. Initially, the Indian forces had to rely on light infantry weapons and a few artillery pieces. The situation was exacerbated by the challenging terrain of JNK, which made the movement of heavy artillery difficult. The roads were narrow, while non existent, and the mountainous terrain posed a significant logistical challenge. Despite these difficulties, as the conflict progressed, the Indian Army managed to bring in artillery guns, including field artillery, mountain guns, and the mortars. Mountain warfare and the light artillery. Given the rugged and mountainous terrain, the use of heavy artillery was often impractical. Instead, light artillery, such as the mountain guns and mortars, played a more prominent role. Mountain guns, which were easier to transport and deploy in the difficult terrain, were highly effective in providing support to the infantry units engaged in the close combat with the enemy forces. The Indian Army used 3.7-inch mountain howitzers, which were relatively light and could be broken down into smaller parts from the for easier transportation by pack animal and manpower. These guns provided crucial fire support in high altitude operations, where the movement of heavier artillery would have been impossible. The limited range and firepower of these guns, however, meant that they were primarily used for direct fire support in the engagement at shorter ranges. Coordination and fire support. The provision of artillery firepower during the operations also highlighted the importance of coordination between infantry and the artillery units. Artillery was primarily used to soften enemy positions before the infantry assaults and provided defensive fire during the enemy counterattacks. However, due to the communication challenges in the remote and rugged terrain, coordinating artillery fire with the infantry movement was often difficult. The Indian Army faced significant challenges in this regard, particularly in the early stages of the conflict. Radios and communication equipment were not always available or reliable, leading to the delays in the RT fire support. Despite these difficulties, as the conflict progressed, Indian forces were able to improve their coordination and make more effective use of the artillery firepower. Pakistan's use of artillery. On the Pakistani side, the use of artillery was similarly constrained by the lack of resources and difficulty of moving the heavy guns through the mountainous terrain. Pakistan initially supported tribal militia or the raiders with limited artillery, and the raiders themselves relied mostly on the small arms. As the conflict escalated, the Pakistani regular forces became more involved. Pakistan was able to deploy more artillery, including field guns and mortars. The use of artillery in Pakistani forces was largely defensive, aimed at holding positions and supporting infantry operations. Impact on key battles. Artillery played a decisive role in the battles during 1947-48 operation. One such engagement where artillery was vital was the Battle of Zojila, where the Indian Army launched a bold offensive to recapture the pass from Pakistani. Artillery fire provided essential support for the operation, allowing Indian forces to break through the well entrenched enemy positions in difficult terrain. So, to conclude, we can say the provision of artillery fire support during the 1947-48 operations was characterized by the limited availability, logistical challenges, use of the light artillery suited to the mountain warfare, difficulties in coordination. Despite these challenges, artillery played a crucial role in both offensive and defensive operations, shaping the outcome of several key battles. Both India and Pakistan learned their valuable lessons from the conflict, which would influence their military strategies in future engagements. Question 2. Give the details of the leadership qualities of Field Marshal KM Cariappa with examples. Field Marshal KM Cariappa, the first Commander in Chief of the Indian Army post independence, is remembered for his exemplary leadership and lasting influence he had on the Indian military. His leadership qualities were marked by vision, integrity, discipline, and deep sense of patriotism. Cariappa's dedication to the army, his commitment to the national service, and his emphasis on the secularism and professionalism made him a revered figure in the Indian military history. Here are some of the key leadership qualities of Field Marshal Cariappa illustrated in the subsequent slides. Visionary leadership. Cariappa had the foresight to see the importance of strong, independent Indian military in the post colonial world. He recognized that the Indian Army had to transition from the a colonial force to the national institution that served the sovereign state of India. One of his first steps as chief commander in chief was to Indianize the top echelons of the military hierarchy, which had been dominated by the British officers. He encouraged the promotion of Indian officers and worked to develop an independent and confident Indian military leadership. His vision ensured that the Indian Army was ready to face the challenges, including external aggression and internal security threats, with a sense of national purpose. Cariappa's efforts helped in creating a unified military force that could defend the newly formed Republic of India. Integrity and discipline. Cariappa was known for his unwavering sense of integrity and strict adherence to discipline. He believed that personal integrity was the cornerstone of the leadership, and this was reflected in the way he conducted himself and expected others to follow. During the Indo-Pak conflict of 1965, Cariappa's son, an Indian Air Force pilot, was shot down and captured by Pakistani forces. When the Pakistani army, under the leadership of General Ayub Khan, offered to release his son as a gesture of goodwill, Cariappa refused the special treatment. He insisted that his son be treated like any other prisoner of war, demonstrating his commitment to the fairness and equality. His dedication to the discipline also extended to the way he managed his troops. Cariappa emphasized that discipline was not only about following orders, but also about internal self control and maintaining a sense of duty towards the nation. Patriotism and nationalism. Field Marshal Cariappa was deeply patriotic and his loyalty to India was one of his defining qualities. His love for the nation guided his decision making and the leadership style, particularly in the formative years of the Indian military. During the partition of India in 1947, Cariappa played a key role in maintaining order and ensuring the peaceful and efficient transfer of military assets between India and Pakistan. His actions during the period were motivated by a desire to prevent unnecessary bloodshed and safeguard India's future security. Cariappa also emphasized the importance of secularism in the Indian army. He believed that the military should be free from religious, regional, or caste based biases. This principle of secularism was critical in maintaining the unity and the professionalism of the Indian armed forces in the country as diverse as India. Decisive and strategic thinking. One of Cariappa's key leadership quality was his ability to think quick and decisive decisions in times of crisis. He had a keen strategic mind and could analyze situations from multiple perspectives, which allowed him to make informed and effective decisions on the battlefield. During the 1947 Indo-Pak War, Cariappa played a crucial role in planning and executing military operations to defend the region. As General Officer Commanding in Chief of the Western Command, he oversaw key operations that helped secure strategic locations, including the relief of Punch and defense of Srinagar. His decisions were critical in the stabilizing the situation and preventing further advance of the Pakistani forces. Inspiring leadership and morale building. Cariappa was an inspiring leader who earned the admiration of his troops. He led by example and was known for his hands on approach, often visiting frontline troops and interacting with them directly. His ability to boost morale and instill confidence in his soldiers was one of his greatest strengths. Cariappa was known to personally visit troops in the front line, particularly during the Kashmir operations in 1947-48. His presence alone boosted the morale of soldiers as they saw their leader standing with them in difficult conditions. This quality of inspiring his men and leaders from the front was one of the reasons for his immense popularity among the rank and file of Indian Army. Focus on professionalism. Cariappa strongly believed in the maintaining the professionalism of the Indian Army. He worked hard to distance the military from the politics and emphasized that the Army's loyalty was to the nation, not to the particular political party or leader. This apolitical stance became a hallmark of the Indian military under his leadership and continued to be one of its defining features. Even after his retirement, Cariappa remained a vocal advocate for keeping the military out of politics. His consistently emphasizing that the role of the armed forces was to serve the constitution and the people of India, not to engage in particular political activities. His belief in the professionalism of the armed forces left the lasting legacy of the Indian military. So, Field Marshal KM Cariappa's leadership was defined by his vision for the unified and independent Indian military, his commitment to the integrity and discipline, and his deep sense of patriotism. His decisive thinking, inspiring leadership, and focus on professionalism helped shape the Indian Army into a capable and respectable institution. Cariappa's legacy continues to influence the military leadership in India today, serving as an enduring example of the service, self sacrifice, and dedication to the nation. Describe the circumstances and the causes of loss of Skardu garrison in 1947-48 operations. The loss of Skardu garrison during the 1947-48 Indo-Pak War was a significant event in the conflict. Skardu, located in the Baltistan region, now part of the Pakistan occupied Kashmir, was a strategically important town due to the geographical position in the mountain terrain of Himalayas. The garrison, defended by Indian forces, was besieged by the Pakistan backed tribal forces and irregulars for several months before it finally fell in August 1948. Several circumstances and causes contributed to the fall of Skardu garrison. We'll see these in the subsequent slides. Strategic importance of Skardu. Skardu, located on the western bank of the Indus River, was a key strategic point in the Ladakh region. Its geographical location gave it control over the access to Ladakh and Gilgit, making it vital for both India and Pakistani forces. For India, holding Skardu was essential in maintaining control over the northern areas of Jammu and Kashmir. While for Pakistan, capturing Skardu was critical for securing Baltistan and threatening the Ladakh region. Initial situation and breakout of hostilities. The conflict in the region began soon after the partition of India in 1947, when tribal militias and irregulars from Pakistan, supported by the Pakistani military, launched a large-scale invasion of the princely state of Jammu and Kashmir. Skardu was part of the princely state and, like the rest of the region, became the flashpoint in the conflict. In early 1948, the garrison of Skardu was manned by a small contingent of Jammu and Kashmir state forces, commanded by Lieutenant Colonel Sher Jung Thapa. His garrison, consisting of 250 soldiers, many of whom were poorly equipped and not sufficiently prepared for a long siege. Given the isolated nature of the Skardu and the garrison defense relied heavily on the reinforcement and supplies from the Indian Army, but the remote location and the challenging terrain made such support difficult. Siege by the Pakistan forces. The siege of Skardu began in February 1948 when Pakistani forces, lo- both tribals and regulars, launched a concerted effort to capture the town. The attackers were motivated by the strategic importance of the Skardu town and aimed to gain control over the Baltistan region to support their broader territorial ambitions. Sherjung Thapa and his men put up a determined defense despite being outnumbered and outgunned. The attackers surrounded the town and cut off all communication and supply lines to the garrison, placing the defenders under intense pressure. Thapa's troops held their ground despite frequent assaults and shelling, and the siege turned into a protracted stalemate, with the defenders running low on food and ammunition and medical supplies as months wore on. Challenges of resupply and reinforcements. One of the primary reasons for the eventual fall of Skardu was the failure to send timely reinforcement and resupply to the garrison. Skardu's isolated location in the mountainous region made it extremely difficult for the Indian Army to send relief troops or supplies. The only reliable route to Skardu was through the Zojila Pass, but this route was blocked by the heavy snowfall and the presence of hostile forces, making it impossible for the Indian Army to maintain a regular supply line to the besieged garrison. Attempts were made to send the reinforcements to garrison. In March 1948, a relief column led by Major Priti Chand of 5th Battalion of the Jammu and Kashmir Rifle was sent to break the siege. However, the relief attempt failed when the column was ambushed by the Pakistani forces and had to retreat. This failure to relieve the garrison was significant setback for the Indian Army. Thus, it left the defenders without any hope of reinforcement. Additionally, support was difficult to be provided due to the high altitude and weather conditions in the region. Although some of the supplies were airdropped, they were insufficient to sustain the defenders for an extended period. Internal issues and morale. Another critical factor contributing to the loss of Skardu was the low morale and the internal challenges faced by the defenders. Over the course of siege, the garrison's morale began to deteriorate due to the prolonged isolation. The lack of supplies and the knowledge of that relief was unlikely. Furthermore, there were reports of desertions by the local soldiers who were part of the Jammu and Kashmir state forces. Many of these soldiers were from the local areas and were ethnically and culturally aligned with the attacking forces, leading to the divided loyalties. Some of these soldiers either deserted or actively switched sides garrison's defenses. Despite these challenges, Lieutenant Colonel Thapa maintained a strong defense for the several months, holding out against repeated attacks. His leadership and determination were remarkable, but the dwindling numbers and supplies made this situation untenable. The final assault. In August 1948, after months of siege, the attackers launched a final concerted assault on Skardu. By that time, the defenders were exhausted, their supplies were critically low, and they were significantly outnumbered. The Pakistani forces, sensing that the garrison was on the verge of collapse, mounted a heavy attack on August 14, 1948. After resisting over 6 months, the garrison was overrun. Lieutenant Colonel Serjang Thapa and his remaining soldiers were captured by the Pakistani forces. Consequences of the loss of Skardu. The fall of Skardu had significant strategic and political consequences. For the Pakistan, the capture of Skardu secured their control over Baltistan region and allowed them to consolidate their hold over part of northern Jammu and Kashmir. It also gave them a strong foothold in the region from which they could launch further operations. For India, the loss of Skardu was a major setback in the war. It weakened their control over the northern frontiers of Jammu and Kashmir and increased the difficulty of defending Ladakh region, which remained vulnerable for further Pakistani advances. Garrison, the loss of Skardu garrison during 1947 operation in was a result of combination of factors: the strategic isolation of the town, the inability to send reinforcement or supplies, the internal challenges faced by the defenders, and the overwhelming numerical superiority of the Pakistan backed forces. Despite the heroic defense led by Lieutenant Colonel Sher Jang Thapa, the garrison eventually succumbed to the pressures of a prolonged siege. The capture of Zojila was a typically rare operation. Describe the sequence of events that led to the capture of strategic pass. The Battle of Zojila during 1947-48 operation was a critical military operation that played a pivotal role in securing the Ladakh region for India. The operation was notable for being one of the first instances in the military history where tanks were used in such high altitudes. The capture of Zojila was a key turning as it restored the India's access to the vital region of Ladakh and ensured that the area remained under control of India. Strategic importance of Zojila. Zojila, a high altitude mountain pass in western Himalayas, lies on the Srinagar Kargil Leh Road. This pass is one of the main gateways to Ladakh, and its control was critical for both India and Pakistan. The pass connects the Kashmir Valley with Ladakh, making it essential for India to retain control over Ladakh and protect its territorial integrity. The Indian forces initially suffered significant setback in Zojila sector. In May 1948, Pakistani forces captured the town of Dras and Kargil, gaining control over the strategic high ground and threatening the security of Zojila. The terrain in the area was extremely challenging with the steep mountains, narrow passes, and freezing temperatures, making it difficult for both sides to operate effectively. Indian troops on Zojila were under constant pressure, facing artillery fire and well entrenched Pakistani positions on the high ridges. Pakistan forces occupied strong defensive positions overlooking the pass, making it nearly impossible for Indian infantry to advance. The Indian army lacked the equipment, firepower needed to dislodge the enemy from these high altitude positions, leading to a sort of stalemate. Planning an assault for the Operation Bison. Realizing the strategic importance of Zojila and the deteriorating situation in Ladakh, the Indian military leadership under the command of Major General K.S. Temaya planned a daring operation to recapture the pass. The operation was codenamed Operation Bison, and it was to be a combined of arms assault involving infantry, artillery, and the novel use of tanks at high altitude. The idea of using tanks in the operation came from General Timaya himself, who recognized that without heavy firepower, it would be impossible to dislodge the and well entrenched enemy forces from these heights. The Indian Army decided to deploy M5 Stuart light tanks of the 7th Light Cavalry Regiment. Even though the tanks were not designed for operation at such high altitudes, the challenges were immense. As the tanks had to be transported over the treacherous terrain in the Zojila Pass, which was covered with snow and ice, the narrow and steep roads leading to the pass were not suitable for tank movement, and considerable engineering efforts were required to widen and stabilize the roads. Despite these challenges, tanks were brought in by the Indian forces with the engineers and soldiers working tirelessly to make the operation feasible. The assault to recapture Zojila was launched on 1st November 1948. The plan involved three-pronged attacks: tank and infantry assault. The M5 Stuart tanks were at the forefront of the assault, combined by the infantry units from 1st Battalion of the Gurkha Rifle 5GR and the 4th Regiment of the Rajput Regiment. The tanks provided the much needed firepower to break through the heavily fortified Pakistani positions. Artillery support. Indian artillery units provided covering fire, targeting the Pakistani positions on the ridges and suppressing the enemy fire. The artillery support was crucial in weakening the defenses and paving the way for tanks and infantry to advance. Flanking maneuvers. The Indian forces also launched flanking attack from the from the surrounding heights to divert the attention and create pressure on the enemy from multiple directions. The Pakistani forces were caught completely off guard by the use of tanks, which they had not anticipated at such high altitudes. The tanks, although initially hindered by the terrain, played a decisive role in breaking through the enemy's defenses. Their firepower allowed the Indian infantry to advance and secure key positions on the ridge. Despite the challenging conditions, the Indian forces pressed forward, and by the end of the day, they had successfully recaptured Zojila Pass. The surprise and the shock of tank assault demoralized the Pakistan force defenders, who were forced to retreat from their positions. The outcome and the significance. The recapture of Zojila was a major turning point in 1947-48 operations. It reopened the road to Ladakh, allowing the Indian forces to send reinforcement and supplies to Leh, which had been under the threat from Pakistani forces. The success of this operation also boosted the morale of the Indian Army and demonstrated the effectiveness of the combined arms operation in high altitude warfare. Following the capture of Zojila, Indian forces continued their advance and eventually recaptured Dras and Kargil in subsequent operations. The victory at Zojila ensured that the Ladakh remained under the Indian control. Strategic lessons and legacy. The Battle of Zojila is remembered as one of the most audacious and innovative operations in the Indian military history. It showcased the strategic thinking and leadership of Major General K.S. Timaya and determination of the Indian forces to defend their territory despite the overwhelming challenges. The use of tanks in such difficult terrain was unprecedented and remains a rare example of the high altitude armored warfare. The success the successful capture of Zojila demonstrated the importance of maintaining control over critical mountain passes in the Himalayan region, a lesson that continues to be relevant in India's defense strategy, particularly in the context of its border with Pakistan and China. The operation also reinforced the need for specialized equipment and training for high altitude warfare, which has since become a key factor for the Indian Army. The next question is: one of the most prominent battle of the J&K operation was the fought at Naushera on 6th February 1948. Briefly describe the enemy's plan for the capture of Naushera. How was surprise maintained by us and initiative wrested from the enemy? The Battle of Naushera, fought on 6th February 1948 during the J&K operation, was a significant engagement between Indian forces and the tribal invaders backed by Pakistan. The enemy's plan for capture of Naushera was well coordinated and aimed to encircle, overwhelm the Indian positions. The overview of the operation and the enemy strategy is given in subsequent slides. Enemy's plan for capture of Naushera. The tribal forces, along with the Pakistani regulars, sought to isolate Naushera and launch a multi-pronged assault to capture it. Their strategy involved that encircling of the Indian garrisons. The attackers aimed to surround Naushera from multiple directions, cutting off all the lines of communication. The enemy hoped to divide the Indian troops and exploit the gaps in the defenses. Surprise and sheer number. The enemy relied on surprise and numerical superiority. They expected to overwhelm the smaller Indian contingent with the weight of their attack, which involved several thousand tribal fighters. Now, how surprise was maintained by Indian forces? Indian defense at Naushera, commanded by the Brigadier Muhammad Usman, anticipated an attack and took several measures to counter it. Accurate intelligence. The Indian forces had gathered detailed intelligence about enemy's movements and intentions, which helped them prepare in advance. Strategic positioning. Indian forces were deployed strategically on key heights around Nashara, which gave them a commanding view of the battlefield. This advantage neutralized the enemy's element of surprise. Fortification and ambushes. The defenses around Nashara were fortified and ambush points were established in anticipation of the enemy's advance. This helped counter surprise and prepared the Indian forces for an attack, wresting the initiative from the enemy. Preemptive action. Brigadier Usman, understanding the strategic importance of controlling the heights, preemptively fortified the surrounding hilltops, especially the vital Taindhar Ridge. By denying the enemy their key positions, the Indian forces could control the battle's tempo. Massive firepower and air support. The Indian defenders used well coordinated artillery and machine gun fire to break up the enemy waves as they approached, causing the confusion and heavy casualties. The Indian Air Force also played a role in disrupting the enemy concentration, further tilting the battle in India's favor. Counterattacks. After absorbing the initial enemy onslaught, the Indian forces launched effective counterattacks. These counteroffensives, led by well trained units, caused panic among the attackers and pushed them back. Leadership and morale. Brigadier Usman's leadership and his high morale of the Indian troops was critical in wresting the initiative from the enemy. His forward planning, combined with the bravery of the Indian soldiers, allowed them to not only hold Naushera but inflict heavy casualties on the invaders. By maintaining situational awareness, preparing defenses, and seizing the tactical initiative, Indian forces were able to turn the tide of the battle and secure decisive victory at Naushera. Question: Srinagar Division's plan of war for the summer offensive was termed as an offensive without teeth. State reasons in support of this statement. The term offensive without teeth was used to describe the Srinagar Division's summer offensive plan during 1947 operation because the operation, despite its ambition, lacked the necessary strength and resources to fully be effective. Several factors contributed to the assessment: insufficient troops and resources, limited infantry strength. The offensive plan required significant manpower to execute large scale operations across the challenging terrain of J&K. However, the available troop strength was inadequate. The Indian forces were stretched thin, trying to defend vast areas while also attempting to launch an offensive. Lack of artillery support. Artillery is crucial in mountain warfare to provide suppressive fire and to support advancing infantry. In the Srinagar division's case, there was shortage of a heavy artillery, which limited the firepower availability to break through well defended enemy positions. Scarcity of the armored support. The offensive plan was further weakened by the lack of adequate armor, tanks, and armored vehicles, which could have provided the necessary punch to drive through the enemy position at some places, or they could have been used to secure these lines of communication or the built up areas like the Baramulla and the Uri area for and relieving the infantry for the task in the offensive. Challenging terrain and logistical constraints. The terrain is mountainous and rugged, making it difficult for large-scale movement of troops and offensive operations. The enemy held advantageous positions on higher ground, making any assault particularly challenging without overwhelming firepower and coordinated logistics. Poor road and supply lines. The infrastructure in the region was underdeveloped, and a few roads were vulnerable to the ambushes and enemy introduction. Poor logistical support hampered the ability to move troops, equipment, and supplies efficiently, which is critical for sustaining an offensive campaign. Communication difficulties. Effective communication is essential for coordinating offensive operations, particularly in the complex terrain. The limited communication infrastructure added to the difficulties of coordinating attacks ac- across the widespread and mountainous battlefield. Underestimation of the enemy strength and preparation. Firstly, the entrenched enemy positions. The tribal invaders had entrenched themselves along with the Pakistani regular forces in well defended positions, especially on the higher elevations. The Indian plan did not fully account for the strength of these positions, leading to the under preparation in terms of firepower needed to dislodge them. Enemy reinforcement. The enemy forces were continuously reinforced by Pakistani irregulars and regular troops, leading to much larger and more formidable opposition than anticipated. This made the offensive objectives harder to achieve without sufficient combat power. Inadequate air support. Limited air capability. The Indian Air Force played an important role in the early phases of the war, particularly in defending Srinagar and supporting the ground forces. However, for summer offensive, air support was limited and the mountainous terrain also made close air support difficult. Without sustaining and overwhelming air support, The Indian forces were unable to decisively break enemy formations or support their advancing ground troops. Absence of clear strategic focus. The Srinagar division's plan lacked clear prioritization of the objective. Instead of concentrating forces for a decisive blow in one sector, the plan was spread thin across multiple fronts, diluting the impact of the offensive. This led to the impression that the offensive had bold objectives but lacked the power to achieve them effectively. Defensive mindset. While the plan called for an offensive, many commanders on ground were lived still in the defensive mindset, focusing on the holding key positions rather than taking bold decisions to push the enemy back. This cautious approach limited the success of summer campaign. Questions you can mull over. First is, what was the main reason for failure of 2 Rogra in taking the Islamabad feature successfully in May 1948? If the examiner has got the tactical mindset, he would like to you to find out the faults with that operation. So, if it is better to read LP Sen's book regarding this. In 1947, a decision was taken to relieve Punch. From humanitarian point of view, this decision may have been commendable, but militarily it was not a wise move justified. Basically, this examiner would like to know this because at that time, the 161 Brigade was well poised to take on offensive towards the Chinari Chakoti area, while uh, after getting some reinforcements. But the planners decided to reinforce Punch area. As a result, the offensive towards Muzaffarabad got petered down, and the attention was diverted towards this side of Punch. Though they did not succeed much in that also, except for the they were able to send in one Kumo in the area of Punch. Describe the plan and deception measures adopted in Operation Kipper. Now, there are many small little operations which you can find in the whole Operation 1947-48. Uh, this is not a small operation, but this operation was to secure the height of Court area, which was 9 kilometers northwest of the Naushera, and it overlooked the Tavi Valley. Thank you.